Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
And I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And today we are at episode 41, and we are going to talk about the love bomber boss.
If only we were so lucky to have some of those.
Well,
not always a good thing, though, I'm guessing. Right?
Exactly. Well, and the phrase love bombing is, quoting Psychology Today, refers to a pattern of overly affectionate behavior that typically occurs at the beginning of a relationship, often a romantic one, in which one party bombs the other with over-the-top displays of adoration and attention. This behavior can include showering the other person with gifts and or compliments, declaring love early on, and or taking steps to remain in constant contact and spend increasing amounts of time together. So love bombing, I don't know that there's any studies about this as being an existing thing, hence the reference.
100%. And usually it's in the context of cult life, whether we're talking about, well, any kind of cult. I don't need to single people out. You know who you are, you cults. But yeah, generally that's what happens at first. And it's been well documented and long standing, And
it's usually spoken of as a negative thing, right? Part of a cult, or it often is a pattern of relationships that end up being controlling or coercive or abusive in some way. And it also happens at work. Right? And so what we want to talk about today is the love bombing dynamic at work and what to do if it happens to you and how to kind of recognize it and avoid it. But I want to start out with acknowledging that sometimes that intense emotional connection at the beginning of let's use a romantic relationship, sometimes it actually is falling in love. Right? There can be a real connection that people can have as friends in a professional context, in a romantic relationship, where there really is a genuine, deep connection that is not coercive, that's positive. And I want to give you an example. So I'm in Seattle. It's a hot day today. I went out early this morning to pick raspberries. I have this raspberry plot with this crazy, huge, it's taller than me, all these berries, all these leaves. And I was picking raspberries. And I heard right next to me in the driveway of my next door neighbor, some contractors. There were three guys, two young, one older, who had been working on the HVAC system for a couple of days. And I am a writer, which I think means that I'm a voyeur and an eavesdropper, and I like to get up and out of other people's business. So as I'm picking raspberries, I'm listening. And the older guy, I'll just call him Mr. HVAC, was giving feedback to the younger guys. And he could have given a masterclass in feedback. He was kind. He was clear. He was like, look, I'm here to teach you guys, and I need to bring you into what it is that I'm doing. And he got really specific. When I was doing such and such, I should have brought you in, and we should, all three of us, build our skills around this and such. And again, I'm eavesdropping, so I don't want to get into specifics, but the way he was talking to these young men, and there was a big age gap. He was probably in his 40s. These guys were apprentices who were in their 20s. He was so respectful and affectionate and positive, but never weird or over the top. And you could see these guys, these are 20-somethings standing in a driveway in a hot day with their boss telling them stuff. And they were paying attention, rapt, they were listening. And he said to them, he's like, look, you guys are young and stronger than I am. You're in better shape, but I don't want you to have all the scut work. I need to do some of that too. And they're like, but you're so much faster. He's like, I'm only faster because I know how to do this. And part of my job is to teach you how to be faster. It was so much. I went around the bush and I was like, look, I'm an executive coach. I'm about to go record a podcast about bad bosses. You are this is fantastic what you're doing here. He's like, who is this gray-haired lady with a raspberry? He's like, what is that? But I wanted to use that example because clearly this supervisor had a genuine connection and affection with these two young men who worked for him. And they seemed to reciprocate it. They were not surprised when I told their boss that he was a good boss. They're kind of like, yeah, we understand that. Yeah. And so it is possible to have a connection with someone at work that is professional, appropriate, affectionate, positive, and boundaried. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah. And also, that's not what we're talking about. But what you said, what I heard is, it's really nice if you have a unicorn And I'm sure it is nice if you have a unicorn, but I've never had a unicorn, and I don't know anybody who's had a unicorn. And outside of those two guys on the other side of the raspberry bush, I've never heard a story like that. So for our purposes,
Right.
let's consider the entire rest of the world who is not loving and understanding.
Yes. So I think the example, some of the things to watch out for with these love bomber bosses, and again, some of them are going to be dramatic, some of them are going to be subtle, but ways to recognize them is, does this boss who is love bombing you have a pattern? So I have worked for a number of bosses who do what I call the flavor of the month move, right? In November, they're all about Trisha. Trisha is the greatest thing since sliced bread. She's the most wonderful. She's fantastic. She's who they're taking to lunch and talking to. And then in December, it's Joe. And in January, it's Beatrice. So they have a pattern of really attaching to one person and showing them a lot of attention, talking to them a lot, spending a lot of time with them. And then it quickly moves. You have a sour look on your face. Is this reminding you of someone?
Yeah, I mean, listen, oh my God. I've often found there are a couple of truisms. The person I found who first seeks your favor and buddies up to you, wants to be a friend at a workplace, is usually the person that you should least likely be friends with, because they've blown it with everybody else. So they're hoping to get their hooks in you before everybody else says, so-and-so's a creep. This has happened to me repeatedly. Now, I'm not the person is not toxic, not noxious, but they are the least well-liked of your future employee, your future coworkers. And then also, anytime, as recently happened to me with the horrible and toxic Aussie media, where my boss, the now convicted fraudster, Carlos Watson, he would attempt to do this team of rivals thing, but it was something that tonally would have made more sense if you came from I have four sisters, but I'm 10 years older than them all. So it was never, didn't grow up with a group of siblings, but I recognized what was happening, where he'd say, well, I took Sean over to Lorene's today. The implication being that if you play your cards right, I might love you like I love Sean and take you over to see our multi-billionaire founder. I mean, for me, the American ideal of merit is so hardwired into me that I don't. If you're taking him over there and he's not doing work that's better than mine, what do I care? I do not care. So anybody who leverages this in the workplace, for me, it's a massive red flag. Massive red flag. You're playing favorites. You love it. Yeah, and that's not the job. I want you out there making it rain, making money, guaranteeing that we have paychecks next week. I don't care who you like here, who does a good job, who's going to make us more money, and who can do that effectively. This other thing is like a sideshow issue. But sadly, I think it becomes central in a lot of these companies, which is why we're talking about it. Unbelievable.
It's almost as if the love bomber boss intentionally raises the emotional temperature on all emotional reactions. So as you mentioned, pitting people against one another. Another thing that I've seen these types of bosses do is have a lot of gossip, right? So they will talk with one party about another party. And, it's gossip masquerading as management, but it's not. It's personal. It's not fact-based. It's often, extremely unkind and prejudicial. There's no assuming best intention. And so it's a lot of times too, they'll also raise the emotional temperature by talking about things outside of work. Right. So I've seen leaders who will have conversations with me or others about, their relationships, their personal finances, things that are not appropriate for a senior leader to be sharing with someone who works for them or is sometimes a couple steps down on the ladder. Because what it does, and and I think the challenge with these kinds of situations is there are people who believe that a high level of emotionality, a lot of sharing of personal items, a lot of emotional connections proves values that they think are important. It builds trust. It's a cultural positive. We are all friends together. We're like family. But there are other people, I happen to be one of them, who feel like that sort of false bonhomie is actually off-putting, that it doesn't build trust, because I think, the situation is going to turn and
Yep.
it's going to go the other way.
Yep. Yeah, I'm not a fan of any time. In fact, when I hear stuff like we're all a big family here, to me, that again, that's a massive red flag. I don't. I like. I mean, look. Let me try just come up with an analogy. I don't have personal feelings about the parts, the engine parts that are in my car. I just want them to work right, and I want them to work really well because it's super important that I get to where I'm going in a safe and expeditious fashion. Right, safe being the word. I can profit greatly if I get someplace without killing myself or others, and that's really what I want. But in the valley here, there's been this weird thing, and it's a weird leveling of a thing because, of course, to fit into the generalized scheme where you're not really creating a lot of waves, but when you're comfortably engaged, you can't be too interesting. Be interesting, but not too. I mean, because you'll get somehow singled out, and this doesn't work in the system. Everybody has to be the same. You have to fall in line behind the CEO, and it's just not. It doesn't. I prefer merit, and I'll tell you a funny story. When I first started, and I hate to keep harping on Ozzy, but I was there for close to 10 years. At one point, the CEO came in and was happy that we had our first office, and I was, okay. We had some furniture from IKEA, and he was out of the office all the time, so it was me and his assistant sitting in 3 rooms, just sitting there, and I'm writing. And he came in and said, "This is great, huh?" And I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "What do you mean, yeah?" I said, "Well, it's just 3 rooms, man. It's He goes, "Well, where?" He goes, "I'm a writer. I could be at home." He goes, "Well, go home then." I go, "Okay, cool." So pick up, go to my kitchen table, sit down at home, start writing. 7 minutes goes by. The phone rings. I pick up the phone. It is a chairwoman of the board. I said, "Oh, hey, how's it going, Louise? How's it? Fine. Hey, we're chatting." She goes, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm writing." She goes, "I didn't say what are you doing?" I said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm at my kitchen table where I'm writing a story on Marcus Dupree." And she's like, "Why aren't you in the office?" I go, "Well, I was in the office. There's nobody in the office." So I talked to Carlos and he said I could go home. She goes, "It's an office. You have an office job. It's about building a culture and it starts with you." I go, "Me? It's just me in the office. Nobody else." She goes, "It starts with you. Get your computer, go back to the office." Apparently, when he sent me home, he was angry. And then he calls her, she calls me. I have to get back, go back to the office. I've wasted an hour in transit. And then I was not taken over to Lorene's as punishment for having the audacity to believe him at his word, take him at his word, and go home to write an article that I now was 2 hours behind on. So all of this weird family emotional stuff with birth order and people, I hate it. I hate it, hate it, hate it. And I'm wondering, and I'd like to ask you, do you believe do you believe that it masks a deeper unhealthiness in a business sense of any company where this would happen? Because I've seen it happen in other companies, and they have ultimately always failed. So I'm starting to make a connection between this happening and failure, right?
The
Or do
the
you have
love
healthy companies
bombing
where it happens?
the love bombing bosses that I have seen, particularly the most egregious examples, those companies have failed.
Yep.
I, so
Okay.
it's not a scientifically statistical number, but it's two pretty significant events and that failed, and that's not counting my brief stint working with Ozzy. So I do think it is challenging. I think what's difficult is that when you're talking about, are you suggesting, to use your car parts analogy, that the workers with whom you are interacting are interchangeable, that they're like pieces of a car engine?
Um, uh, from a performance perspective, yes.
Okay.
Right. I mean, even people now, my last job title at Ozzy was editor at large. And that's just because they didn't want to call me deputy editor and they didn't dare call me editorial director. So they just figured, okay, he's been here the longest, just let him call whatever. And so, but these job titles, they're not fungible. But at the same time, your expectation, your silo, you've got to perform well. And if you can't perform well in that job, then somebody else could perform well in that job. So good spark plugs, bad spark plugs, better spark plugs. I think these are not, and I mean, it sounds weird to talk about, but I'm a car guy, so it doesn't sound unloving to me.
I also think there's a couple of other factors, right? Which is we are this same age. And thank you to those of us who noticed, those of you that noticed that we didn't have our last podcast on our regularly scheduled time, because it was what I'm calling our birthday break. Our birthdays are a week apart. We are now 62. And we came up at a time where we faced various forms of discrimination and bad behavior and difficulties. And so, at least for me, I've always been aware that I need to keep a certain distance at my job. I think where I'm curious is, I think we're anomalies in that. And my guess is that if we had people who were in their, 30s and 20s, they would have very different understandings and experiences. And I think if you look at television, look how many successful workplace dramas there are, where the entirety of the story is how a group of people interact together in the workplace, whether it's a hospital or a police precinct or whatever. Like, there's a real fascination with that dynamic of here are people who are put together through luck, circumstances, skill, whatever, choice, and they have this dynamic. And I think it's compelling. And I think it's compelling because we spend a ton of time at work. And the people with whom we work can really make or break our success at our job, our interest in our career, our kind of day-to-day satisfaction. And I do think that wherever we go, there we are. And people who have unresolved issues in their families will often bring them to their workplace, right? I mean, I think that's part of my job security as an executive coach, is be able to often say, does this dynamic that you're experiencing remind you of anything that's happened in your life before? Like, hello? So I think that there's going to be inevitable crossover. There's going to be inevitable replaying of sibling rivalry or mom and dad dynamics and people projecting. I don't think you can get rid of that. I think the idea is when it crosses that line.
Yeah. It's funny. It took me years of working in another group of folks before I realized what the hell? I was baffled as to what was going on. And then I finally realized I was dealing with a bunch of younger brothers. They're all younger brothers.
Yep.
Right. And I'm the oldest. So and so when we were at loggerheads, it was constantly, continually, because I said something imperious. And the younger brother in them, even though these are men in their 40s, were like, they couldn't abide, and at the same time, when they would do the kind of tentative younger brother thing of like, well, maybe I would just kind of run roughshod over it. Maybe either say it or don't, like Yoda, they would have a negative response. So once I figured that out, I could always take what you kind of always advise, which is to take a breath, realize what's happening, and then fashion a response that gets us to finish faster,
But I think one of the things that you mentioned is when you're talking about that story of Ozzy, that was obviously pre-COVID. And this is one of the challenges that comes up over and over again is how much emotional connection and interpersonal interplay do you need to create culture? And does that have to happen in person? And I don't think that we have a good answer for that. And I think that's part of the challenge, is to sort out, because you talk about being the only person in the office. There are plenty of people that make the commute, pay for parking, put their kids in childcare, get to the office and spend all day on Zoom meetings with people who are not there. Right?
Yeah.
There's one or two other people, like the woman at Wells Fargo who died on a Tuesday in her cubicle, and nobody found her body until Friday. Unfortunately, true story. So I think that this idea, it is important for us to be intentional about, first of all, just understanding as leaders, as an organization, how much connection do we have to have? And then does that connection necessarily need to be in person face to face. I mean, there were lots of clients there were executive coaching clients that I coached for 2 full years during the height of the pandemic and never met in person. And clearly they found benefit of it because we kept continuing to work together. And so I think that adds complexity as well.
Yeah, there's also this thing that I was listening to somebody complain about their freelancer contractor, independent contract employee, and they were complaining about how their boss had talked to them. And it was clear to me that the person who was complaining to me believes that they are co-owners, that as a contract employee, that we are doing business together. But it's also clear by the complaint that was levied that the owner of the business believes that this person is an employee. So, but I started to think about, okay, understanding and management is always going to want to see the people they manage, one, for deeply personal reasons. So I feel like I'm doing a good job. They like being here. They like what I'm doing. It's my feedback. This is my job. I had a manager once say, I said, listen, how much is my bonus? She goes, $5,000. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you my $5,000 if I don't have to write this performance review for you. And she goes like, that's okay. You got to do it anyway, because if I don't get you to do it, I don't get my bonus, which is a lot more than $5,000. So go do it. So the idea is that with management, you either, I think, inherently think about things as a manager, as management, or as an employee. And my ex-wife was not only a lawyer, and we have a great relationship now, so this is not a knock. But she grew up. Her family business was a major Eastern Nevada cattle ranch business, and so what she heard at home, what she experienced working summer jobs, was always from a management perspective. So a lot of times when I would come home from work complaining about something from the employee perspective, she was identifying with management. Why don't you just do what they tell you? So these things with the whole love bombing, I mean, the point that you make is great. This is from family relationships to familiar. I mean, it cuts a lot of different ways, but I feel justified now in still being wary of somebody who uses this as a management deal. This "I love you now," "I love you now" thing. I don't want to trust it. I don't feel good about it ever.
What I think is also worth noting is that the reason love bombing works in any arena is because people are hungry for it. Right. And so like in the dating world, like I've had a number of conversations that I've been thinking about recently with women who are over 40, many of them like over 50, who are single and dating and trying to meet people on dating apps. And they are, I'm not suggesting that this isn't accurate, but they find it very frustrating because the people that they want to be dating, the men, and if they're in sex relationships, the men that they're dating want to date women they believe who are like 10 to 15 years younger than they are. Wow. And so they walk into it with this sense of scarcity. And there's a kind of almost hunger. Like what they want to understand from me, and the reason I've been thinking about this is like, how did I find a partner when I was in my 50s? Like, how is that possible? And they want this like magic formula. And I realized that, through their experience, which I think is valid, and also through the cultural stereotypes of, the value or lack thereof of women over a certain age, they're starving for it. And I realized they're waiting for me to give them some magic potion. And I'm like, luck, lots of therapy, but that hunger makes them vulnerable. Right? And I'm not suggesting men can have the same thing, right? That desire, you're so desperate for love. You have, people who have built up this idea that they're not somehow complete unless they're partnered or whatever it is that they have. And, or just the financial reality of being a single woman trying to fund retirement and healthcare and all the things. They want that so badly that they are susceptible to an ersatz version of that in love bombing. They manipulate. And I would argue the same thing happens with work. People of all ages deeply want a work environment that is meaningful to them. They want what they see on TV of people being connected with one another, the movies that, this idea of like, these are my work friends, my work BFF, my work spouse. And they want that. And I think it makes them susceptible to this highly inflated emotionalism at work.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the thing that makes it feel so cheap and onerous to me. And that's that you're playing on the vulnerable, and it never worked. Like when I recently wrote about this, so it's in my mind. Where my boss puts his hand on my knee and says, "I don't believe anybody's loved you like I love and respect your work." It's like, you're crazy, right? You do know, I come from a loving family. I've got loving siblings. I'm married. But, what made me really angry is that if I was one of those cats who had a troubled upbringing and who had somehow luck, pluck, and perseverance had managed to come through a great university and get a degree and a pretty, blessed career, that might have actually worked, and how dare you kind of leverage it against somebody in order. And again, this is not, and this is a point maybe that hasn't been made, and kind of maybe the point I was trying to make when I talked about engine parts, which is that this is not in pursuance of increased productivity, right? Or increasing quality in the workplace. This is done purely to manipulate. And if it happens,
they want more power.
Right.
Yeah.
And if it benefits the business, that's fine. But centralized power on the head of, in the form of a, controlling CEO is not always the same as a successful business. I would venture to say that Elon Musk is is not nearly as effective of a CEO as he imagines he is. Right. I mean, just based on business indices. Right. I'm just looking at numbers now, so but all that stuff happens, and it's not a mistake I mentioned Musk, because I have a guy who worked for him and also partake in that kind of management. You're either in or you're out, and if you're out, nobody pays attention to you. If you're in, right, well, you could do. You don't have to be talented to be in. You just have to have kissed the right ass, and that's not healthy. That's not a good business model. They won't teach you that at Wharton. They won't teach you that at Columbia. This is not a business school thing, but we're giving it to you for free here on the Bad Boss Brief. They know that this is not good business. So,
and I think a couple things, because we want to end with some practical advice. If you are in this situation, the first, and you are being love bombed, or you suspect that that's what's happening with a boss, I had a couple things written down, but I want to tag onto what you just said. First is just do a quick audit of the support you have outside of work. Are you as an individual? I mean, the Surgeon General is talking about an epidemic of loneliness, right? A lot of people don't have good families. They aren't close to the people that they grew up with. They are alone. Look and maybe do a little loneliness audit. Like, are you putting too many emotional eggs in the personal side of your work business? Should you look at joining a club, or, like starting a new sport, or just being around other people in a different way? Second, be very wary. These kinds of super intense emotional interactions are generally short-lived. They burn themselves out. So, if your boss is giving you big promises about salary or compensation or time off or opportunities, get it in writing, because chances are this is going to pass. The next thing is, be very careful. If you are being love bombed, everybody else is noticing. Don't fall into that competitive thing. Don't get into sibling rivalry that love bomber boss puts you in, because it's going to destroy your relationships with the other people that you work with when your boss's attention inevitably moves on. And then, the idea is to just don't get sucked into it. Like, if you're enjoying it, if you're getting the special meetings and the, trips and the benefits, don't count on that happening, and make sure that you're insulated by having performance that you can show to somebody else, right? So if your boss leaves, gets fired, whatever, and the next boss comes in and says, why are you getting all the special treatment? You want to be able to document that. You want to be able to clearly show what it is. And I think Because so often what I've seen happen, and you're right, it has often been people who come from very dysfunctional families,
Yeah.
get sucked into this dynamic, and it lasts for a while. And then when it shifts, it can be really damaging, not just professionally, but emotionally. It's like the worst kind of breakups, only you can't actually say it's a breakup because it wasn't a romantic relationship. But I've seen people just adrift and lost because suddenly the boss has somebody else that, they want to go out to happy hour with, or have accompany them on trips or any of that kind of stuff. And so just, be wary.
You said that, and I just, what I was going to ask is there a way to stop this when you show up? But then I started to remember that when I made the worst movie of 1987, which was Leonard Part Six with Bill Cosby, there was a weird, strong, weird vibe of the one very much that we're talking about. And of course, now given what we know about Cosby, it shouldn't have been strange at all that he was loving up on some of the younger production assistants, and we all break for lunch at the same time, be at the wagon, and they'd be able to sit at his table, and there'd be this weird. And I remember there's a guy, one of the guards. We played, it's like a James Bond pot boiler, and we played the henchman for this woman who was trying to take over the earth. And I've never had any of that John Hughes high school weirdness with walking around with my tray. Where do I sit? Or Adapted for Men in Oz. I'm in prison. What table is it? I just get my food because I'm all about the food. I get the food. I sit down at the table. If other people show up, cool. If not, I can eat in peace. And so I get my thing, and I see Bill there, and just the vibe was not of interest to me. So I just sit my ass down and start eating. One of the other guards comes, and he has been at Cosby's table, but for some way he's gotten the sign not to go over, and he sits down next to me or across from me, and he was miserable the entire lunch. He's like, well, I wonder what they're talking about. I go, hey man, go over there. Otherwise, let me eat in peace. And he's like, well, they're sitting there, and it was morbid and disgusting, and I couldn't look away. His desire to be part of something that so much didn't want him to be part of it. It was really, really strange. And I mean, again, I don't need much proof to know that this is something that should be stopped, but I had no idea how to stop it. Otherwise, telling him, why don't you go sit with them if that makes you happy? I'm going to enjoy my meal here. So,
Well, I think the way to stop it, because I'm on the opposite end. I'm that guy. Right. There have been so many times in work environments where I've wanted so desperately to be the in crowd, because I was that kid at school that was like, where can I sit? I was not the popular, none of that. Right. So that was my default, was I want to be part of the in crowd. And when I wasn't, I would feel sad. I would feel alone. I would feel adrift. And I think that, that's why I talk about, building things that are important to you outside of your workplace, recognizing that there may be things like there were for me in your past that cause you to project something onto a boss, right? Most of the people that get sucked into this have issues with one of their parents, right? And again, I'm not talking about coaching stuff. I'm just talking about things that I've seen in my work life. And, so I think the way to stop it, if you are facing this and don't want to be in this situation, is number one, do your own emotional homework, check it out with a coach or trusted advisor or somebody that you can talk about some of these things with, see if you're tapping into old patterns and dynamics. And the second is you can just opt out. I mean, if a love bomber is loving on you and you're not responding, if you say, you know what, I appreciate it, but I can't do happy hour today. You know what, I'm not able to go out to lunch right now. If you drop the rope, they will find somebody else who can participate. So it is an opt-out often. If you feel safe enough, it is an opt-out situation, because you're right. There is, as you mentioned about the Bill Cosby on the set, there's a Venn diagram in which the love bombing overlaps with sexual harassment and a hostile work environment and a whole other level of threat. And we would be remiss in not mentioning that. So that's another reason to be aware and to decide if you want to participate in that. So we've actually come to the end of our time. Did you have something else that you wanted to?
I gotta fire me.
Oh, tell me to fire me.
Oh, this is in my mind a big one, and I would have waited to talk about this on my other podcast, but it happened yesterday.
Okay.
So it is, and I was taking into account the people who I've interviewed over time. And I've interviewed Roy Choi, Marcus Samuelson, a lot of the foodies. And one of the foodies that I've interviewed is Eddie Huang. I don't know if you've heard of him. All right, kid, see you later. And Eddie Huang. Eddie Huang. So Eddie Huang was like a Harvard grad, but decided that he wanted to get into cooking, did a book called Fresh Off the Boat. He's spelling it Huang. Actually did a TV show. Big deal, the big deal. And he put into development something that into 2023 that now is debut. I think it's playing at Cannes, which is why it's come up in the news. And the headline is perfectly titled, Vice is Broke, because his ascendancy was marked closely with the $6 billion valuation that marked Vice magazine at their height. Eddie was a perfect Vice poster boy. Was hipster appeal. It was, I really liked him when I interviewed him. Grew up working in restaurants, did the Harvard thing, got his law degree, but said, screw that, had a black girlfriend, the whole bit. And but he now, as Vice is broke, on the occasion of their declaration of bankruptcy, which doesn't mean they're out of business in 2023, he's said, Vice is broke, and he starts detailing the ways in which they screwed him out of money, which I love, because Vice still owes me for the Vice Guide to Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, where I wrote a whole chapter, and it was never been paid for, ever. And that book has sold well over 40,000 copies. A little bit of love would help, right? So he does this. He puts out this movie. People are talking about it. He's a very appealing guy, very affable. He's got the gift of gab. And so he's talking it up at Cannes or wherever they debuted. And it didn't take long, but this morning, a Vice magazine, as it is, because Gavin McInnes, of course, became the head of the Proud Boys, and we'll just leave that there. Shane Smith took over and then got bumped for Nancy Dubuque because of the overwhelmingly sexist environment and a number of different complaints. So, but Vice issues a response to Eddie's. Eddie doesn't work at Vice. We don't. Rather than say, Eddie, come talk to us, their response is combative, it's hostile and snarky. I mean, their brand was always snark, but the hostile thing is something else. And to me, it struck me as tonally wrong, because you guys know you screwed a lot of people. And something like that, you could have just said nothing. But now that you've jumped on Eddie, I'm starting to think, yeah, well, you know what? Am I also a creep? Because I want the money that you clearly spent on beach houses and luxury automobiles. I thought it was really, really aggressively tone deaf. They should have come to us to figure out how to respond to this, and they did not. And I'm sure somebody there thinks it's funny and cheeky and edgy, but nobody thinks it's funny when you're playing with their money. So I'm going to give them a big thumbs down on that kind of response. And that, if I don't know if it's Nancy Dubuque who oversaw it. I mean, Nancy Dubuque is in charge, so it's got to be her to a certain degree. But I thought that was tone deaf to the extreme, and it's going to cause you more problems down the road, 100% guaranteed.
Well, and it's also, there's, to be an organization that purports to do original journalism and content, to steal from content creators, to steal from content creators of color.
Yes.
And then,
yeah, right.
That's problematic on so many levels. And I think, again, I've talked about this before. There are people whose entire job, expertise, and experience is in crisis communications. You can hire them. You can call them on the phone and they will tell you, shut the fuck up.
Yes.
Don't say anything. There are people who, if you have a stroke, you're not going to call up your buddy and say, hey, what's a quick, quippy response? You're gonna go find a really good neurosurgeon, right? You want a trained professional to be managing your crisis communications, not something, just kind of off the cuff. So thank you for that, Fire Me. And if you have any comments on this episode, any idea for future episodes, any questions that you want us to answer, WTF@badbossbrief.com. WTF@badbossbrief.com. I read every single one, and I would love a break from the jazz hands template that I'm getting 17 or 18 of a week about. It's exactly the same header. It's exactly the same something about, trying to sell me something. So please send me a real email at WTF@badbossbrief.com, and we will talk about you.
There you go.
Okay.
We'll talk about you anyway.
All right.
In a nice way if you write a letter.
See you guys in a couple weeks. Bye.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, work case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.